April 8, 1232. The city of Kaifeng, capital of the Jin Dynasty, sweltered under a scorching sun as 15,000 Mongol warriors completed their encirclement of the most heavily fortified city in northern China. Inside the massive walls, over 1 million people, soldiers and civilians, crammed together, prepared for what would become one of history's most consequential sieges. Outside, under the command of Subutai, the greatest military mind of the Mongol Empire, an army unlike any the world had ever seen tightened its noose around the doomed city. The Mongols had conquered half the known world. They had swept across the steppes, destroyed kingdoms, toppled empires. Their composite bows, their lightning cavalry tactics, their ruthless efficiency had made them masters of warfare from Korea to the edges of Europe. But here, at Kaifeng, they would face something they had never encountered before, something that would change warfare forever. The defenders of Kaifeng possessed weapons that spat fire and thunder, that turned men to ash, that could penetrate armor with explosive force. The Chinese called these weapons huoyao, fire medicine, what we know today as gunpowder. This is the story of the day the Mongols first faced gunpowder on the battlefield, a technological confrontation that would reshape military history and ultimately spread these devastating weapons across the entire world. To understand what happened at Kaifeng, we need to go back 2 decades, to when Genghis Khan himself first turned his attention to China. In 1211, the Great Khan declared war on the Jin Dynasty, the Urtian people who ruled northern China with an iron fist. The Jin were no weaklings. They had conquered this territory from the previous Liu dynasty and had built one of the most sophisticated military machines in Asia. They commanded 300,000 troops, controlled vast resources, and possessed something the Mongols had never seen: advanced siege weaponry and early gunpowder devices. But the Jin made a fatal mistake. They underestimated the Mongols, seeing them as just another wave of steppe barbarians who would raid, loot, and disappear. They were wrong. The Mongols weren't raiders anymore. They were conquerors building an empire. In 1213, Mongol forces besieged Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, then the Jin capital. The siege was brutal. The Mongols, masters of open battlefield warfare, struggled against massive stone fortifications. They couldn't breach the walls through conventional assault, so they did what they always did: they adapted. They used Chinese engineers, captives and defectors who understood siege warfare to build their own siege engines. They employed psychological warfare, cutting off all supplies and letting starvation do their work. After months of suffering, the Jin emperor sued for peace, paying enormous tribute in gold, silk and jade. The Mongols withdrew in 1214, and the Jin, foolishly believing they had bought safety, moved their capital south to Kaifeng, hoping distance would protect them. It wouldn't. The Mongols returned in 1215 and this time took Zhongdu after its population had been decimated by starvation. But taking empty cities wasn't Genghis Khan's style. He wanted total conquest. Over the next decade, Mongol armies systematically dismantled Jin defences across northern China. They learned, they observed, they incorporated Chinese military technology into their arsenal, and they encountered, for the first time, weapons that used explosive powder. The earliest gunpowder weapons weren't guns as we think of them. They were bombs, incendiary devices, and fire arrows. The Chinese had been experimenting with gunpowder since the 9th century, originally seeking an elixir of immortality. What they found instead was a substance that could kill on a scale previously unimaginable. By the time of the Jin Dynasty in the early 13th century, military engineers had perfected several devastating weapons. There were fire arrows, arrows tipped with gunpowder tubes that would ignite mid-flight, creating both psychological terror and actual damage. There were thunderclap bombs, ceramic vessels filled with gunpowder that exploded on impact with terrifying noise, and most ominously, there were the first iron-cased bombs, predecessors to modern grenades and artillery shells. The Jin had used these weapons defensively in previous battles against other Chinese dynasties. In 1126, when Jin forces besieged the Song capital of Kaifeng, yes, Kaifeng had changed hands before, Song defenders used thunderclap bombs that created such terrifying noise and confusion that Jin soldiers fled in panic. One witness recorded that when these bombs exploded, they sounded like thunder from heaven and threw attacking forces into complete disarray, with many soldiers screaming in fright and abandoning their positions. Ironically, after conquering Kaifeng, The Jin had captured Song artisans who manufactured these weapons and put them to work creating an arsenal for the Jin military. By 1232, the Jin possessed the most advanced gunpowder weapons in the world. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the conquest of the Jin remained unfinished. His son Ogedei Khan, elected as the new Great Khan in 1229, made completing his father's work a priority. In 1230 he launched a new offensive. 2 massive Mongol armies, one commanded by Ogedei himself and another by his brother Tolui, invaded Jin territory from the north and west. The Jin, now reduced to controlling only Henan province and the area around Kaifeng, marshalled their remaining forces for a desperate defence. They had 300,000 troops, formidable fortifications, and their secret weapons, the most advanced gunpowder arsenal ever assembled. In January 1232, the Mongol forces, now commanded by Subutai after Ogedei and Tolui returned to Mongolia, reached the Yellow River. On January 28th, advance units spotted the walls of Kaifeng rising from the plains, like a mountain of stone and brick. On February 6th, the main Mongol army began assembling around the city. By April 8th, the encirclement was complete. Inside Kaifeng, the situation was already desperate. The city, which normally held around 400,000 people, now sheltered over 1 million. Refugees from across the Jin Empire had flooded in, seeking protection behind the massive walls. Food stocks adequate for a normal population would be stretched impossibly thin. Emperor Aizong of Jin, the last emperor of his dynasty, watched from the palace as Mongol campfires ringed the horizon in every direction. He knew what was coming. The Mongols never failed to take a city once they had committed to a siege. But he also knew his defenders had something the Mongols had never faced in sustained combat: weapons that could level the battlefield. The Mongol army that besieged Kaifeng was unlike any force in history. Subutai, commanding the siege, was arguably the greatest general of the 13th century. He had fought in more campaigns than any man alive, had led armies from Korea to Russia, and had never lost a campaign he personally commanded. His forces were organised in the Mongol decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 called tumens. This organisation allowed for incredible flexibility and communication on the battlefield. Each warrior was a master archer and horseman, capable of firing accurately from horseback at full gallop. They carried composite bows that could penetrate armour at 200 yards. They were disciplined, ruthless, and had conquered every enemy they had faced for over 20 years. But sieges were different. The Mongols had learned the hard way that cavalry charges meant nothing against 30-foot stone walls. So they adapted. They built siege engines, massive trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds over city walls. They constructed battering rams, siege towers, and portable shelters called mantlets to protect engineers as they approached fortifications. And most importantly, they had incorporated thousands of Chinese soldiers and engineers into their forces, men who understood siege warfare and Chinese defensive tactics intimately. Many of these Chinese had defected from the Jin, seeing the Mongols as the inevitable victors and preferring to be on the winning side. Subutai's siege plan was methodical and brutal. First, complete encirclement. Nothing and no one would enter or leave Kaifeng. He ordered his men to construct over 100 kilometers of stockades, watchtowers, trenches and guardhouses surrounding the city. Chinese captives, men, women and children, were forced to haul supplies and fill in defensive moats. This wasn't just about blocking escape. It was about creating a siege infrastructure that could be maintained for months or even years. Second, constant pressure. Mongol archers would maintain harassing fire against any defender who showed themselves. On the walls, siege engines would pound the fortifications day and night, not necessarily to breach them immediately, but to wear down the defenders' morale and exhaust their ability to repair damage. Third, starvation. Subutai knew that with over 1 million people inside and no supplies coming in, time was his greatest weapon. Eventually Kaifeng would consume itself, but the Mongols also brought their own secret weapon, gunpowder bombs. By 1232 the Mongols had been fighting the Jin for over 2 decades. They had captured Jin arsenals, interrogated Jin engineers, and most importantly, they had convinced or coerced Jin artisans to work for them. The siege of Kaifeng would see gunpowder weapons used by both sides, perhaps the first major battle in history where both armies possessed explosive weaponry. The siege began in earnest on April 10th, 1232, 2 days after the encirclement was completed. Jin scholar Liu Qi, trapped inside the city, would later write a haunting memoir describing what he witnessed. Liu was a student at the Imperial University, a young intellectual who found himself experiencing the end of his civilization in real time. His account, Records from a Return to Obscurity, written just 3 years after the siege, provides the most detailed eyewitness testimony we have of this momentous battle. Liu described the opening bombardment. The attack against the city walls grew increasingly intense, and bombs rained down as the enemy advanced. This is one of the first historical references to the Mongols using gunpowder bombs offensively. The Mongols had learned well from their enemies. Their trebuchets, massive counterweight siege engines, hurled not just stones but gunpowder bombs over Kaifeng's walls. These early bombs were likely similar to those the Jin themselves had used, ceramic or iron vessels filled with gunpowder lit with a fuse and launched before they exploded. When they detonated inside the city, they created chaos. The explosions themselves could kill or injure anyone nearby. The fires they started threatened to burn entire districts, and the psychological impact was devastating. Civilians who had never experienced combat were subjected to random explosions day and night, never knowing when the next bomb would fall on their home. But the Jin defenders weren't passive victims. They had their own arsenal, and it was far more advanced than anything the Mongols possessed. This is where gunpowder warfare truly entered history, in a way that would change everything. The Jin deployed several types of weapons. First, fire arrows, huojian in Chinese. These were arrows fitted with primitive rocket mechanisms. A tube of gunpowder attached to the arrow shaft would be ignited, creating thrust that propelled the arrow farther and faster than a conventional bow could manage. When these fire arrows struck targets, the gunpowder tube would explode or burn, causing additional damage and starting fires. Second, fire lances. These weapons deserve special attention because they were the direct ancestors of firearms. The official history of Jin, compiled after the dynasty's fall, provides a detailed description that's worth examining carefully. To make the flying fire lance, use Chihuang paper, 16 layers of it for the tube, and make it a bit longer than 2 feet. Stuff it with willow charcoal, iron fragments, magnet ends, sulphur, white arsenic, which historians believe was actually saltpeter, a key gunpowder ingredient and other ingredients, and put a fuse to the end. Each troop has hanging on him a little iron pot to keep fire, probably hot coals, and when it's time to do battle, the flames shoot out the front of the lance more than 10 feet, and when the gunpowder is depleted, the tube isn't destroyed. This was a flamethrower, essentially. A soldier would carry what looked like a spear with a paper tube attached to it. When the fuse was lit, the gunpowder mixture would ignite and shoot flames and projectiles, those iron fragments and other materials, out the front of the lance for over 10 feet. The psychological and physical impact was tremendous. Imagine being a Mongol soldier, having fought across half of Asia, facing enemies who used bows, swords, spears, conventional weapons you understood. Then suddenly a defending soldier points what looks like a spear at you. There's a hissing sound, and a jet of flame mixed with molten metal fragments shoots out, covering you and your comrades in fire. The history of Jin notes that when these fire lances were wielded and set alight, no one dared go near. Mongol soldiers, typically disdainful of Jin weapons, greatly feared the flying fire lance. This is significant. The Mongols had conquered the most formidable armies in Asia. They had destroyed kingdoms equipped with the finest conventional weapons. But this new technology genuinely frightened them. It was something outside their experience, something their tactics and equipment couldn't easily counter. Then there were the bombs, and this is where we reach the weapon that would become legendary, the heaven-shaking thunder bomb, or Zhentianlei in Chinese. The heaven-shaking thunder bomb represented a quantum leap in explosive weapon technology. Earlier bombs had used ceramic or soft metal casings. The heaven-shaking thunder bomb used thick iron. This is crucial. An iron casing could contain the explosive force of gunpowder much longer before rupturing, creating a much more powerful explosion. It also fragmented into deadly shrapnel when it finally did explode. The official history of Jin describes it in terms that make clear how devastating this weapon was. The heaven-shaking thunder bomb is an iron vessel filled with gunpowder. When ignited and discharged, it explodes with a crash of thunder that can be heard for 100 li. That's about 30 miles, burning an expanse of land more than half a mu, roughly 1/12 of an acre, and the fire can even penetrate iron armor. Liu Qi, witnessing these weapons from inside Kaifeng, recorded their effect on the attacking Mongols. From within the walls, the defenders responded with a gunpowder bomb called the heaven-shaking thunderbomb. Whenever the Mongol troops encountered one, several men at a time would be turned into ashes. This isn't poetic exaggeration. The combination of explosive force, burning gunpowder mixture, and iron shrapnel could indeed incinerate anyone at the centre of the blast and kill or maim multiple soldiers with a single explosion. For the Mongols, this was unprecedented. They had faced many weapons, but nothing that could simply erase men from existence with a single blast. The Mongols, for all their tactical genius, struggled to cope with these weapons in the early weeks of the siege. Their standard tactics relied on speed, maneuverability, and overwhelming an enemy before they could organise an effective defence. But here, they were the ones being attacked. Their siege engineers, trying to undermine the city walls or set up battering rams, were targeted by defenders dropping these bombs or firing fire lances from the ramparts. The leather screens and mantlets they constructed to protect their workers couldn't withstand the explosive force. The history of Jin records a particularly effective tactic the defenders used. The Mongols constructed elaborate screens of thick leather to cover workers who were mining under the city walls, digging tunnels to collapse the fortifications. These workers would excavate protective niches right at the base of the walls, assuming the defenders above couldn't reach them. They were wrong. Jin defenders took iron cords and attached them to heaven-shaking thunderbombs. The bombs were lowered down the walls, and when they reached the place where the miners were working, the bombs were set off, and the excavators and their leather screens were together blown up, obliterated without a trace. This was devastating tactically and psychologically. The Mongols prided themselves on their engineering capabilities, on their ability to adapt and overcome any defense. But how do you defend against a weapon that can be lowered on a chain and explode next to you? The leather that protected against arrows and even ballista bolts was useless against explosives. Workers began refusing to approach the walls, slowing the siege operation significantly. For several weeks, the battle settled into a grim pattern. By day, Mongol siege engines would pound the walls while archers traded fire with defenders. By night, both sides would attempt raids and counter-raids. The Mongols tried to rush the walls with scaling ladders, only to be driven back by fire lances and arrows. The Jin tried to sortie out and destroy Mongol siege equipment, but these attacks were cut down by Mongol archers before they could reach their targets. The constant bombardment, the lack of food, the cramped conditions with over 1 million people in a space meant for less than half that number it all took a terrible toll on Kaifeng's population. Disease began to spread. First dysentery from contaminated water, then typhus from the lice infesting the crowded shelters, then something worse. Li Gao, a Jin physician who was in Kaifeng during the siege and wrote about it 15 years later, described an epidemic of catastrophic proportions. After some of the initial Mongol assaults were repulsed in the 3rd month of the siege, barely 1 or 2 out of every 10,000 people in the capital did not get sick, and the sick who died followed one another without end. At each of the capital's 12 gates, the dead sent out each day were 2,000 at most and no less than 1,000 at fewest, and this was so for almost 2 months. 2,000 dead per gate per day, times 12 gates, times 60 days. That's potentially over 1 million deaths from disease alone, though modern historians debate whether Li Gao's numbers might have been exaggerated or misremembered. Regardless of the exact figure, the epidemic was clearly catastrophic. Interestingly, Liu Qi's memoir doesn't mention an epidemic of this scale. He mentions deaths from the siege itself and from starvation in the later stages, but not mass disease in the early months. This discrepancy has puzzled historians. Some believe Li Gao, as a physician, was more attuned to disease and remembered it more vividly. Others think the epidemic might have been localized to certain parts of the city. Still others have proposed something more sinister, that the Mongols, perhaps intentionally or perhaps accidentally, introduced plague to northern China during their campaigns. This theory remains controversial and unproven, but the timing and scale of epidemics associated with Mongol sieges across China in this period is striking. Whatever the cause, disease, combined with bombardment and gradually diminishing food supplies, was turning Kaifeng into a hell on earth. But the defenders fought on. They had to. Surrender to the Mongols was not a guarantee of mercy. The Mongols sometimes spared cities that surrendered without resistance, but Kaifeng had already killed thousands of Mongol soldiers. There would be a price to pay if the walls fell. The Jin defenders' best hope was that the siege would break, that reinforcements would arrive, or that the Mongols would be forced to withdraw due to threats elsewhere. That hope, slim as it was, kept them fighting through the summer of 1232. In late summer, there was a brief possibility of negotiated peace. The Jin sent diplomats to the Mongol camp to discuss terms. For a few weeks, the bombardment eased. It's possible that during this temporary lifting of the siege, disease spread more rapidly as the two forces came into closer contact, which might explain Li Gao's observations. But any hope of peace was shattered when Jin forces, possibly acting without imperial approval, assassinated the Mongol diplomat Tang Qing and his entire entourage. This was a fatal mistake. Subutai's response was immediate and merciless. The bombardment resumed with increased intensity. Any pretense of restraint vanished. The Mongols hauled their largest trebuchets closer to the walls and began a systematic destruction of Kaifeng's fortifications. Day and night, stones and bombs rained down on the city. The defenders responded in kind, their heaven-shaking thunderbombs taking a steady toll on Mongol forces. But the mathematics of attrition were against Kaifeng. The Mongols could replenish their supplies and ammunition from the surrounding countryside and their supply lines stretching back to Mongolia. The Jin could not. Every bomb they used was one less bomb in their arsenal. Every arrow shot, every ounce of gunpowder expended brought them closer to having nothing left to fight with. By October 1232, 6 months into the siege, Kaifeng was starving. The initial food stocks had been consumed, then the emergency reserves, then anything that could possibly be eaten. Historical accounts from later Chinese sources mention cannibalism, though it's unclear if these reports are accurate or propaganda designed to emphasize the horror of the siege. What's certain is that thousands were dying every week from starvation. The soldiers defending the walls were weakened, unable to effectively man their positions or operate the heavy siege equipment needed to counter Mongol attacks. The gunpowder weapons that had held the Mongols at bay for months were becoming less effective, not because the technology had failed, but because there weren't enough healthy soldiers to deploy them properly. Emperor Aizong, watching his capital die around him, faced an impossible choice. He could stay and perish with his people when the walls inevitably fell, or he could flee and attempt to rebuild Jin resistance elsewhere. In December 1232 he chose the latter. Under cover of darkness, the emperor and a small retinue of officials slipped out of Kaifeng through a secret passage. They fled south to the city of Guide and eventually to Kaiju, where they hoped to establish a new base of resistance. This was the beginning of the end. The emperor's flight shattered whatever morale remained among the defenders. If their ruler had abandoned them, what were they fighting for? General Kui Li, left in command of the city, made a ruthless calculation. He ordered the execution of officials and military officers who remained loyal to the fled emperor, eliminating potential opposition to what he planned to do next. Then, in February 1233, he opened negotiations with Subutai to surrender the city. On May 29, 1233, more than 13 months after the siege began, the gates of Kaifeng opened and Mongol forces entered the capital of the Jin Dynasty. Subutai, under orders from Genghis Khan, did not order a general massacre. This was unusual for the Mongols and probably reflected a pragmatic calculation. Kaifeng's population was already devastated. Killing the survivors would eliminate the labor force needed to rebuild the city and govern the territory. The Mongols wanted to rule China, not preside over a wasteland. But the looting was extensive. The Mongols stripped the city of anything valuable. The imperial treasury, accumulated over a century of Jin rule, was hauled away on countless wagons. Weapons, including the precious gunpowder arsenal, were confiscated. Skilled artisans, especially those who knew how to manufacture gunpowder weapons, were identified and taken into Mongol service, willingly or otherwise. This last point is crucial. The Mongols had encountered gunpowder weapons before Kaifeng, but the siege represented their first sustained exposure to the full range of Chinese gunpowder technology. More importantly, they now had access to the engineers and artisans who could produce these weapons. The Mongols, as they always did, would incorporate this new technology into their own arsenal. The fall of Kaifeng didn't end the Jin dynasty immediately. Emperor Aizong held out in Kaizhou for another year. But without Kaifeng, without the resources and population base it represented, the Jin were finished. In 1234, Mongol forces, now allied with the Song Dynasty, who foolishly thought helping the Mongols destroy the Jin would protect them, besieged Kaizhou. Emperor Aizong, seeing no way out, committed suicide. The Jin Dynasty was no more. For the Mongols, Kaifeng was a turning point. They had conquered the city, but at a high cost. Mongol casualties during the 13-month siege were significant, probably in the thousands. For an army that typically won through maneuverability and shock tactics, sustaining heavy losses in a grinding siege was unusual. They had learned that gunpowder weapons were genuinely dangerous and effective. They had also learned that they needed these weapons themselves if they were going to continue conquering the world. Over the next few decades, the Mongols would become some of the most enthusiastic adopters of gunpowder technology. They would improve upon Chinese designs, develop new weapons, and most importantly, they would carry this technology west. The question of whether the Mongols used gunpowder weapons in their European campaigns is one of the most debated topics in medieval military history. We know they invaded Hungary and Poland in 1241, just 9 years after Kaifeng. We know they won decisive victories, most notably at the Battle of Mohi in April 1241, where they annihilated a Hungarian army of perhaps 60 to 80,000 men, and we have tantalizing hints from European sources that the Mongols used weapons that terrified the Europeans, weapons that produce smoke, fire, and explosive sounds. Master Roger, a Hungarian cleric who survived the invasion, described in his chronicle how the Mongols used siege engines launching fiery projectiles that produced noises like thunder. Jan Długosz, a 15th century Polish chronicler writing about the Battle of Legnica, also in 1241, described a Mongol standard-bearer violently shaking a standard topped with a giant ugly head, from which burst a cloud with a foul smell that enveloped the Polish forces and made them nearly faint, incapable of fighting. Was this a gunpowder weapon? A smokescreen created by burning gunpowder? Modern historians are divided. The evidence is ambiguous and often comes from sources written centuries after the events. European chroniclers wouldn't have known what gunpowder was, so they described these strange weapons using the only terms they knew: Greek fire, naphtha, mysterious Eastern sorcery. What we can say with confidence is this: the Mongols definitely had access to gunpowder weapons by 1241. They had captured the Jin arsenals, they had Jin engineers in their service, and we know from later campaigns that they used gunpowder weapons extensively. Whether they actually deployed them in Europe is less certain, but the possibility is real. If they did use them, even in limited quantities, it would make Mohi and Legnica some of the first battles in European history where gunpowder weapons were employed. The irony is that even if the Mongols brought gunpowder weapons to Europe in 1241, the technology didn't take root immediately. The Mongol invasion was cut short when the great Khan Ogedei died in December 1241, and the Mongol princes recalled their armies to Mongolia to participate in choosing a successor. Europe got a reprieve. The Mongols never returned in force. Gunpowder technology would eventually reach Europe, probably through multiple routes: the Silk Road, Islamic intermediaries, and possibly Mongol contacts. But it would take another century before Europeans truly began to develop their own gunpowder weapons. The Chinese, meanwhile, continued to refine and improve their gunpowder technology. The Song Dynasty, which had briefly allied with the Mongols to destroy the Jin, would soon find themselves facing the same enemy, and the Song had even more advanced gunpowder weapons than the Jin had possessed. The Mongol conquest of the Song took decades, from 1235 to 1279. This wasn't because the Song were stronger militarily than the Jin. They weren't. It was because the Song understood the strategic importance of gunpowder weapons and invested heavily in their production and development. During the famous siege of Xiangyang, which lasted from 1268 to 1273, Song defenders used an incredible array of gunpowder weapons. They had bombs, fire lances, fire arrows, and something new: early cannons. These weren't cannons as we think of them, not yet, but they were tubes that used gunpowder to propel projectiles, the ancestors of artillery. The Song held out against the Mongols for 45 years. That's longer than any other opponent the Mongols faced in Asia or Europe. Gunpowder weapons were central to this resistance. One historian noted that in the Chinese, the Mongols encountered more stubborn opposition and better defense than any of their other opponents in Europe and Asia. Eventually the Mongols won, but by that point they had completely incorporated gunpowder technology into their military. When Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, finally conquered the last Song holdouts in 1279 and established the Yuan dynasty ruling all of China, he commanded an army that included some of the most advanced gunpowder weapons in the world. and the Mongols, who now controlled the largest empire in history stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe, became the primary vector for spreading this technology across Eurasia. We have archaeological evidence of this spread. In the ruins of Xanadu, Kublai Khan's summer capital, archaeologists discovered a bronze hand cannon dating to 1298. It's only 14 inches long, small enough to be held and fired by a single soldier, and it represents one of the earliest true firearms in history. This cannon was probably manufactured by Chinese artisans working under Mongol supervision. Similar weapons began appearing across the Mongol Empire in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. We have records of Mongol forces using gunpowder weapons in their campaigns against the Islamic world. When the Mongols invaded the Middle East in the 1250s and 1260s, they brought gunpowder weapons with them. Some historians believe the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt defeated a Mongol army and stopped their westward expansion, saw both sides using early cannons. The evidence is debatable, but what's clear is that gunpowder technology was spreading rapidly across the Islamic world in this period. Arab and Persian scholars were writing treatises on gunpowder manufacture, giving it names like Chinese snow and Chinese fire, acknowledging its origins. By the early 14th century, gunpowder weapons had definitely reached Europe through the complex networks of trade and conquest that the Mongol Empire had created. The first undisputed European reference to gunpowder comes from Roger Bacon in 1267. The first illustration of a cannon in Europe appears in an English manuscript from 1326. The first confirmed use of gunpowder weapons in European warfare was at the Siege of Metz in 1324. Within a century of the Siege of Kaifeng, gunpowder weapons had spread from China to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The Mongols weren't solely responsible for this spread, but their empire provided the infrastructure, the trade routes, the cultural exchanges, and the military incentives that accelerated the process dramatically. And it all started at Kaifeng in 1232. The heaven-shaking thunderbombs that terrified Mongol soldiers, the fire lances that shot flames 10 feet, the iron-cased explosives that turned men to ashes, these weapons marked the beginning of a new era in warfare. Before gunpowder, warfare was dominated by muscle power and simple physics. Bows, swords, catapults, they all relied on human or animal strength to inflict damage. Gunpowder changed this fundamentally. It allowed humans to harness chemical energy on a scale previously impossible. A single man with a hand cannon could kill an armoured knight. A crew with a bombard could destroy castle walls that had stood for centuries. Artillery made cavalry charges suicidal. Firearms made the skills of a master archer obsolete. This wasn't just a technological change. It was a social and political revolution. In medieval Europe, power was based on expensive equipment and years of training. A knight represented a massive investment: armour, horses, weapons, and a lifetime of combat training. Only the wealthy could afford to be knights, which meant only the wealthy had military power. Gunpowder weapons democratized warfare in a brutal way. A peasant with a few weeks of training could use an arquebus to kill that knight, with his lifetime of training and expensive equipment. This shift would contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized nation-states with professional armies. In China, gunpowder weapons contributed to the decline of nomadic power. For millennia, steppe nomads like the Mongols had terrorized settled civilizations. Their mobility and archery skills gave them a crucial advantage, but gunpowder weapons, especially artillery and firearms, negated that advantage. A cannon doesn't care how fast your horse is. By the 16th century, the age of nomadic conquerors was largely over. The last great nomadic empire, the Timurids, fell in the early 16th century, and it was firearms that made the difference. The Siege of Kaifeng in 1232 was the hinge moment. It was the first time the Mongols, the most successful nomadic conquerors in history, faced sustained gunpowder warfare. They recognized the power of these weapons immediately. Within a generation, they had not only adopted gunpowder weapons, but were improving them and spreading them across their empire. Liu Qi, the Jin scholar who witnessed the siege and survived, lived to see the Mongols conquer all of China. He died in 1250, never knowing that the terrifying weapons he had seen at Kaifeng would eventually spread across the entire world. His memoir, written in 1235, remains one of the most important sources we have for understanding what actually happened during that pivotal siege. Li Gao, the physician who documented the horrific epidemic during the siege, became one of the most influential doctors in Chinese medical history. His experiences at Kaifeng led him to develop a new theory of medicine called internal damage theory, which was used in Chinese medicine for centuries. He died in 1251, also having witnessed the complete Mongol conquest of his homeland. Subutai, the Mongol general who commanded the siege, went on to lead campaigns all the way to Eastern Europe. He died in 1248, having commanded armies in more successful campaigns than any general in history. His adaptation and incorporation of gunpowder technology into Mongol warfare was one of his most lasting legacies. Emperor Azong of Jin, who fled Kaifeng and committed suicide in 1234, was the last emperor of his dynasty. With his death, the Jin Dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, vanished from history. But the weapons his engineers had created to defend Kaifeng lived on and changed the world. Today, if you visit the site of ancient Kaifeng, you'll find a modern city with little obvious reminder of the medieval siege. But archaeologists have found evidence. Arrowheads, both conventional and from fire arrows, fragments of ceramic and iron vessels that might have been bomb casings, burn marks on stone foundations, the physical evidence of that 13-month siege where over 1 million people died and where the Mongols first truly encountered the devastating power of gunpowder warfare. The heaven-shaking thunderbombs of 1232 were crude by modern standards. They were hand-lit, difficult to aim, and probably as dangerous to their users as to their targets. But they worked, they killed, they terrified, and they showed what was possible. Within 2 centuries, gunpowder weapons had evolved into cannons that could batter down any fortification. Within 4 centuries, firearms had made traditional armour obsolete. Within 6 centuries, rifled barrels and explosive shells had transformed warfare completely. By the 20th century, the chemical energy of gunpowder had been supplemented by high explosives, and the descendants of those heaven-shaking thunderbombs included artillery shells that could destroy entire city blocks, aerial bombs that could level cities, and eventually nuclear weapons that could end civilization itself. The thread runs directly from Kaifeng in 1232 to the battlefields of World War I, where artillery killed millions, to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. This isn't to say that gunpowder was inherently good or evil. It was a technology. Humans used it for whatever purposes they chose. But it's worth remembering that this technology, which has shaped the modern world in countless ways, had its first major battlefield test at Kaifeng, when Jin defenders used heaven-shaking thunderbombs to turn attacking Mongol soldiers to ashes. The Mongols, having never faced anything like this before, adapted as they always did. They learned, they incorporated, they spread the technology across their empire and beyond. In doing so, they ensured that gunpowder weapons would not remain a Chinese secret. They would become a global phenomenon, reshaping warfare, politics, and society on every continent. The day the Mongols first faced gunpowder on the battlefield was the day the world changed. The thunder that echoed across Kaifeng in 1232 was the sound of the future arriving, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The psychological impact of that first encounter with gunpowder at Kaifeng cannot be overstated. The Mongols were not men who frightened easily. These were warriors who had crossed the Gobi Desert, who had climbed mountain ranges, who had faced armies 5 times their size without flinching. Genghis Khan had instilled in them an absolute confidence in their superiority. They believed, genuinely believed, that no force on earth could stop them, and for decades they had been proven right. But the heaven-shaking thunder bombs challenged that certainty in a fundamental way. When a Mongol warrior saw his comrade standing next to him one second and reduced to ashen fragments the next, with nothing he could have done to prevent it, it created a new kind of fear. This wasn't being killed by a superior archer or a better swordsman. This wasn't even being killed by superior tactics. This was being erased by something that felt almost supernatural, a weapon that didn't require skill or courage to operate, just the knowledge of how to light a fuse. The Mongol military system was built on meritocracy and observed reality. Officers rose through the ranks based on success. Tactics that worked were adopted. Tactics that failed were abandoned. Weapons that proved effective were copied and improved. This pragmatic approach had made them the most formidable military force in the world. So when they encountered gunpowder weapons at Kaifeng and recognized their effectiveness, there was never any question about whether they should adopt this technology. The only question was how quickly they could master it. The Chinese engineers and artisans taken from Kaifeng's workshops became some of the most valuable captives in the Mongol Empire. These weren't just skilled workers. They were men who understood the complex chemistry of gunpowder manufacture, who knew the ratios of saltpeter, sulfur and charcoal that produced the most powerful explosive effect. They knew how to cast iron casings that could contain the blast long enough to maximize the explosion. They knew how to construct fuses that burned at predictable rates, allowing soldiers to light a bomb and throw it or launch it before detonation. The Mongols didn't just force these men to make weapons, they learned from them. Mongol officers observed the manufacturing process. They asked questions, they experimented. Within a few years of Kaifeng's fall, the Mongols had established their own gunpowder production facilities, staffed initially by Chinese experts, but gradually training Mongol and other subject peoples in the craft. This knowledge transfer was systematic and deliberate. The Mongols understood that if they relied entirely on Chinese expertise, they would always be dependent. They needed to internalize this knowledge, make it their own. By the late 1230s, just a few years after Kaifeng, Mongol armies besieging Song Dynasty cities were using gunpowder weapons with the same proficiency as their Chinese opponents. The difference was that the Mongols combined these new weapons with their traditional strengths, mobility, psychological warfare and tactical flexibility. A Song Dynasty city might have superior gunpowder weapons, but the Mongols had gunpowder weapons plus the most mobile cavalry force in the world, plus a command structure that could coordinate operations across thousands of miles. The siege of Xiangyang, which began in 1268, 36 years after Kaifeng, demonstrated how far Mongol gunpowder technology had advanced. Xiangyang was a fortress city guarding a crucial crossing of the Han River. The Song had made it virtually impregnable, with massive walls, extensive fortifications, and a garrison equipped with the latest gunpowder weapons. The Mongols, now under Kublai Khan's command, besieged the city for 5 years. 5 years. This was the longest siege the Mongols ever conducted, a testament to both Song defensive capabilities and the stalemate that occurred when both sides possessed roughly equivalent gunpowder technology. The siege became a contest of engineering and industrial capacity. The Song defenders used fire arrows, bombs and early cannons to defend the walls. The Mongols responded with their own bombs, fire arrows, and something new, massive counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling projectiles weighing up to 300 pounds over the walls. Both sides were also experimenting with what historians call proto-cannons, metal tubes that used gunpowder to propel projectiles. These weren't the cannons we think of from later centuries. They were crude, dangerous to operate, and not particularly accurate. But they represented the next evolution of gunpowder warfare, the transition from bombs and fire lances to true artillery. The breakthrough at Xiangyang came in 1272 when Kublai Khan brought in 2 Muslim engineers from Mesopotamia, Ismail and Ala al-Din, who had been captured during Mongol campaigns in the Middle East. These men designed and built massive trebuchets that the Chinese sources called Muslim trebuchets, capable of throwing heavier projectiles farther than anything previously seen. When these trebuchets began hurling enormous stones and gunpowder bombs into Xiangyang, destroying towers and buildings, the psychological effect on the defenders was devastating. The city surrendered in 1273, not because the walls were completely breached, but because the defenders lost hope that they could hold out any longer. This brings up an important point about gunpowder warfare in this early period. The actual destructive capability of these weapons, while significant, was often less important than their psychological impact. A heaven-shaking thunderbomb that killed 5 men was certainly deadly, but a skilled archer could kill 5 men too, given enough time. What made the bomb special was that it killed those 5 men instantly, simultaneously, in a terrifying explosion of fire and noise. It was unpredictable, impossible to defend against with skill or armor, and it violated every expectation soldiers had about how combat worked. Medieval warfare, before gunpowder, had certain understood rules. Armor protected you from arrows and swords. Shields blocked projectiles. Walls kept attackers out. Courage and skill mattered. Gunpowder violated all these rules. Armor didn't protect against iron fragments traveling at supersonic speeds from an explosion. Walls could be destroyed by bombs and later by cannons, and courage meant nothing when a bomb could kill you before you even knew it was there. This created a new kind of psychological warfare. Defenders on city walls lived in constant fear of bombs being hurled over the battlements. Attackers approaching walls knew they might encounter fire lances shooting flames from murder holes and arrow slits. The randomness of it, the fact that death could come literally out of the blue sky as a bomb arced over the walls, wore down morale in ways that conventional warfare didn't. The Chinese understood this psychological dimension. Their names for gunpowder weapons emphasize sound and shock as much as destructive power. Heaven-shaking thunderbomb, ground-shaking thunderbomb, fire dragon issuing from water. These names were designed to intimidate, to make the weapons seem like natural catastrophes or mythological monsters rather than mere tools. By the time the Mongols completed their conquest of the Song Dynasty in 1279, both sides had been using gunpowder weapons for nearly half a century. The technology had advanced significantly. Bombs were more powerful and reliable. Fire lances had evolved into weapons that could shoot projectiles, not just flames. And crucially, the first true cannons were being developed. A cannon dating to 1288 was discovered in Manchuria in 1970. It's a bronze tube about 14 inches long, with a bore of about 1 inch, designed to fire arrow-like projectiles. This weapon, called a fire lance gun or huo chong in Chinese, represents the transitional technology between fire lances and true firearms. It used gunpowder to propel a projectile through a tube, but it was still small, handheld, and probably not very accurate or powerful. Yet it pointed the way to the future. Within a few decades, larger versions of these weapons would appear, true cannons capable of firing iron or stone balls with enough force to damage fortifications. The Mongols, having conquered China and incorporated all this technology, now controlled an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, and they had the best gunpowder weapons in the world. This created a unique situation in world history. For the first time, a single political entity controlled both the most advanced weapons technology and the logistical infrastructure to spread that technology across an entire continent. The Silk Road, which had existed for over 1,000 years as a trade route connecting East and West, became under Mongol rule more secure and active than it had ever been. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, meant that merchants, scholars, and travellers could move from China to Persia to Europe with relative safety as long as they had Mongol permission. Ideas and technologies flowed along these routes as surely as silk and spices. Gunpowder knowledge travelled west along multiple paths. Chinese artisans were sent to Persia and Central Asia to manufacture weapons for Mongol forces stationed there. Muslim engineers and scholars, fascinated by this new technology, experimented with their own gunpowder formulas and weapon designs. European merchants and travellers who visited the Mongol courts witnessed demonstrations of gunpowder weapons and brought descriptions back home. One such traveller was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who spent years at Kublai Khan's court in the 1270s and 1280s. His account, The Travels of Marco Polo, contains descriptions of what he called stones that burned, gunpowder, and weapons that used this substance. While some historians have questioned whether Marco Polo actually visited China at all, arguing his account contains inaccuracies and omissions, others point out that his descriptions of gunpowder weapons are generally accurate and could only have come from first-hand observation or very detailed second-hand accounts. Whether Marco Polo personally saw these weapons or not, his account, widely read in medieval Europe, helped spread knowledge about gunpowder. But it wasn't just travel accounts that transmitted this knowledge. By the early 1300s, concrete evidence of gunpowder technology appears in Islamic and European sources. The first known Arabic work on gunpowder and firearms, the Book of Military Horsemanship and Ingenious War Devices, was written by Syrian scholar Hassan al-Ramah in 1280, just 1 year after the Mongols completed their conquest of China. Al-Ramah's book describes gunpowder formulas, rockets, and incendiary weapons in remarkable detail. He calls gunpowder Chinese snow, explicitly acknowledging its origins. He provides recipes for different types of gunpowder, optimized for different purposes, some for making loud noises, others for producing lots of smoke, others for maximum explosive force. This level of detail suggests al-Ramah had access to Chinese or Mongol knowledge, either through captured documents, conversations with experts, or his own observations. The timing is significant. The Mongols invaded the Islamic world in the 1250s and 1260s, conquering Baghdad in 1258 and establishing the Ilkhanate in Persia. Chinese engineers and soldiers were part of these Mongol armies, bringing their weapons and knowledge with them. Islamic scholars, pragmatic and intellectually curious, quickly recognized the importance of this new technology and began their own experiments and improvements. One of the fascinating aspects of gunpowder's spread is how quickly each culture adapted it to their own needs and circumstances. The Chinese had developed gunpowder weapons primarily for siege warfare and defending fortifications. The Mongols used them as part of combined arms tactics, integrating gunpowder, weapons with cavalry and traditional siege equipment. The Islamic world, with its strong traditions in chemistry and alchemy, focused on improving the gunpowder formula itself and developing new types of incendiary weapons. They created more stable gunpowder that could be stored longer without degrading. They experimented with adding different substances to produce coloured flames or toxic smoke. They developed self-propelled rockets, effectively the first cruise missiles that could be launched at enemy positions without requiring catapults or trebuchets. The Europeans, when they finally gained access to gunpowder technology in the early 1300s, immediately saw its potential for breaking the military stalemate that had existed in European warfare for centuries. Medieval European warfare was dominated by heavily armoured knights and stone castles, both of which were extremely expensive and extremely effective. A castle could hold out against besieging armies for months or years. A charge of heavy cavalry could break almost any infantry formation. Gunpowder weapons promised to change both these realities. The first undisputed European reference to gunpowder comes from Roger Bacon, an English friar and philosopher in 1267. Bacon described a formula for making a substance that could produce a flash and a loud noise, though he encrypted the proportions in a code, possibly to prevent misuse. Scholars have debated whether Bacon actually knew how to make real gunpowder, or was just repeating rumours he'd heard. The consensus is that he probably had some genuine knowledge, possibly from Arabic sources or from travellers returning from the East, but that his formula wasn't quite right and wouldn't have produced very powerful explosions. More significant is a manuscript called De Officiis Regum, created in 1326 for King Edward III of England. This manuscript contains the first known European illustration of a cannon, a vase-shaped device lying on its side on a wooden table, with a soldier touching a hot wire to a vent hole to fire it. An arrow-shaped projectile is shown emerging from the cannon's mouth. This illustration proves that by 1326, just 47 years after the Mongols completed their conquest of China, Europeans not only knew about gunpowder, but had developed their own cannon designs. The spread of this technology in less than half a century is remarkable, and would have been impossible without the Mongol Empire creating the infrastructure for long-distance knowledge transfer. The first confirmed use of gunpowder weapons in European warfare came in 1324, at the Siege of Metz, where defenders used primitive cannons to help repel attackers. Within a few years, references to cannons, guns, and gunpowder appear in records from across Europe. By the 1340s, during the early years of the 100 Years' War between England and France, both sides were using cannons in sieges, though these early European cannons were crude, unreliable, and not particularly effective. They were more valuable for the psychological effect, the thunderous noise and smoke, than for their actual destructive power. But European metalworkers and engineers, building on centuries of experience with bells, ironworking, and mechanical devices, rapidly improved cannon design. By the 1370s, European cannons were large and powerful enough to batter down castle walls, something that had previously required months of siege work and mining operations. This had profound social and political implications. The castle, which had been the foundation of feudal power for centuries, suddenly became vulnerable. A local baron in his stone fortress could no longer defy a king who arrived with siege cannons. Centralized monarchies with the resources to manufacture and deploy cannons gained a decisive advantage over feudal lords. The balance of power shifted from local strongmen to central governments. Similarly, firearms, which Europeans developed in the late 1300s and early 1400s, began to make armoured cavalry less dominant on the battlefield. A peasant with an arquebus, after a few weeks of training, could kill an armoured knight who had spent his entire life training for war. This didn't happen overnight. Early firearms were slow to load, unreliable and inaccurate. For more than a century, traditional cavalry and longbowmen were more effective than gunmen in most battlefield situations. But the trajectory was clear. Firearms kept improving. They became more reliable, more powerful, more accurate. By the early 1500s, infantry armed with muskets and pikes were the dominant force on European battlefields, and the age of the mounted knight was ending. All of this, the transformation of European warfare, the rise of nation-states, the decline of feudalism, traces back to gunpowder technology that the Mongols first encountered at Kaifeng in 1232 and then spread across their empire. The Mongols themselves, ironically, eventually became victims of the technology they had done so much to spread. By the 16th century, gunpowder weapons, especially firearms and artillery, had become sophisticated enough to neutralize the traditional advantages of nomadic cavalry. The Ming Dynasty, which overthrew the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China in 1368, used firearms extensively in their campaigns to drive the Mongols back to the steppes. The Ottoman Empire, which conquered Constantinople in 1453, used massive siege cannons to breach walls that had stood for over 1,000 years. The Safavid Empire in Persia, the Mughal Empire in India, and later the Russian Empire all used firearms and artillery to subjugate or destroy nomadic peoples who had previously been able to raid settled civilizations with impunity. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where the Ottoman Empire defeated the Safavid Empire, was won largely because the Ottomans had firearms and field artillery, while the Safavids relied primarily on traditional cavalry. The Mughal conquest of India in the early 1500s was enabled by Mughal superiority in firearms and artillery. The Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia in the 1600s and 1700s was made possible because Russian soldiers with muskets could defeat much larger forces of nomadic warriors armed with traditional weapons. The era of nomadic conquest, which had lasted for millennia and reached its apex with the Mongols, was over. Gunpowder weapons had made the difference. There's a deep historical irony here. The Mongols, the most successful conquerors in history, encountered a technology at Kaifeng that they recognized as powerful and important. They adopted it, spread it, and used it to complete their conquest of China. But in doing so, they ensured that future settled civilizations would have the means to defend themselves against nomadic invaders. The very weapons that had frightened Mongol soldiers at Kaifeng in 1232 would, 3 centuries later, end the nomadic threat permanently. The heaven-shaking thunderbombs that turned Mongol soldiers to ashes were the ancestors of the muskets and cannons that would eventually drive the Mongols' descendants back into irrelevance. This pattern, where a technology that provides an advantage in the short term fundamentally changes the strategic situation in the long term, is common throughout history. The stirrup gave nomadic peoples an advantage over settled civilizations for centuries, but settled civilizations eventually adopted the stirrup and used their superior resources to build larger cavalry forces. The machine gun gave European colonial powers an overwhelming advantage in Africa and Asia in the late 1800s, but colonized peoples eventually acquired machine guns of their own and used them in independence struggles. Nuclear weapons gave the United States a brief monopoly on ultimate destructive power. But within years, the Soviet Union developed its own nuclear weapons, and the age of mutually assured destruction began. Gunpowder followed this same pattern. It gave whoever possessed it first a decisive but temporary advantage. Once it spread, which it inevitably did because knowledge is almost impossible to contain, the advantage shifted to whoever could produce and deploy these weapons most effectively. And that turned out to be settled civilizations with large populations, extensive resources, and sophisticated manufacturing capabilities. The Mongols, despite their tactical brilliance and organizational genius, couldn't compete with China, Persia, Europe, or the Ottoman Empire in sustained gunpowder production. They didn't have the mining infrastructure to extract saltpeter, sulfur, and metal ores on an industrial scale. They didn't have the metalworking traditions to cast high-quality cannons and gun barrels. They didn't have the population base to train large forces of gunmen while still maintaining traditional cavalry forces. So despite being early adopters of gunpowder weapons and spreading the technology worldwide, the Mongols ultimately became obsolete in a world where gunpowder weapons were dominant. This transformation took centuries, but it was inexorable. The siege of Kaifeng in 1232 was the beginning of the end, not just for the Jin Dynasty, but for the entire nomadic way of warfare. The Mongols would continue to be formidable for another century or more, but the seeds of their eventual decline were planted the moment they first encountered those heaven-shaking thunderbombs. The legacy of that day in April 1232, when 15,000 Mongol warriors first experienced the terror of gunpowder weapons, echoes through every subsequent century of warfare. every cannon that shattered a castle wall, every musket that killed a knight in armour, every rifle that made cavalry charges obsolete, every artillery barrage that turned World War I into a grinding war of attrition, every aerial bomb that destroyed cities in World War II, all of these descend in a direct line from the heaven-shaking thunderbombs of Kaifeng. The chemistry is the same, rapidly burning or exploding substances producing gas that expands violently, creating force that can propel projectiles or destroy structures. The principle is the same, using chemical energy rather than muscle power to inflict damage. The evolution from hand-lit ceramic bombs to GPS-guided cruise missiles is a story of incremental improvements over 8 centuries, but the fundamental technology that makes it all possible is gunpowder, first developed in China, first used extensively in warfare at places like Kaifeng, and spread worldwide largely through the Mongol conquests. If you want to understand why the modern world looks the way it does, why nation-states with professional armies are the norm, why castles and fortified manor houses are museums rather than centres of power, why cavalry is ceremonial rather than military, you have to understand gunpowder and its consequences. And if you want to understand how gunpowder spread from its Chinese origins to become a global technology, you have to understand the Mongol Empire and its role as the vector that transmitted this knowledge across Eurasia. The day the Mongols first faced gunpowder on the battlefield was the day the world began changing into the world we know today. Liu Qi, the young scholar who witnessed the siege and wrote about it, couldn't have known that the terrifying weapons he saw, the bombs that turned men to ashes and the fire lances that shot flames 10 feet, would eventually reach every corner of the world. He was just trying to survive and record what he saw for posterity. But his account, preserved through the centuries, gives us a window into one of history's true turning points, the moment when the most powerful military force in history encountered a technology that would ultimately render their way of war obsolete. The Mongols adapted as they always did. They learned to make and use these weapons themselves. They spread the technology across their vast empire, and in doing so, they changed the course of human history in ways they couldn't possibly have imagined. The thunder that echoed across Kaifeng in April 1232 was the sound of the medieval world ending and the modern world beginning. 8 centuries later, we're still living with the consequences of that day, when heaven-shaking thunder bombs first turned Mongol warriors to ashes and showed the world that warfare would never be the same again.